achieve. Okay, so let's talk about this topic of today's talk. I have worked on this topic for last several, I would say, years. The first study what I have done on the energy crop was the cost, what is the cost involved in, in growing these energy crops. But later on I got it, in fact, as I said that it's not about me. My student actually got interested, a PhD student, now she's a faculty at University of Arizona, and she got interested in this project about what are the implications of growing these crops. Okay, let me say first about the crops, the energy crops, which produce which used to produce ethanol, which I'm going to discuss. But you see these crops in the first figure, and these are grown in our research farm at University of Illinois, and which motivated us to carry out this research, because all these crop data provided us a lot of information to develop the models, which I'm going to use. I'm not going to present the model. I've been told not to say too much technical things, but I just want to say upfront that actually all the data which have been collected at our university research site, have been used and gone into this developing the tools which I have used to study, for this research, in fact. Okay, so let me start saying something about my research. I do research, and I should not say I do research, but students in my research group work on interactions, understanding the land-climate interactions and how these interactions particularly, impacted by the human activities. And we are developing the tools, in fact, actually, to improve the understanding of this interaction, particularly the biogeophysics in the Earth system model, which deals with energy and the water, which I'm going to also deal in today's talk, as well as the biogeochemistry. The biogeochemistry deals with the nutrients, carbon and the nitrogen. And Liang is sitting here, and he knows, he's expert on this topic. So we are developing the tools and improving these methods in the Earth system models. And as I have mentioned about how these processes are being impacted by the human activities, there are many kinds of human activities. The major one, which we deal in our research group, are deforestation, clearing the forest fires, expansion, of cropland due to the deforestation or many other reasons. But also we are interested in the northern high latitudes, permafrost. Ice is melting, and how these melting of ice is impacting our climate in terms of the greenhouse gases. A lot of nutrients have been stored, not only the carbon, nitrogen as well. So as the ice, and methane as well. Okay? So as the ice is melting in the northern high latitude, and how it is impacting the climate. So these are some of the the research work our student is actually dealing with. Okay, regarding today's talk, first I will discuss about students. I know. I want to give some basic understanding what is the motivation of studying this topic. That's the most important thing. Then what are the overall objectives we address in the science questions, and what kind of tools and approach we use to address those questions, and the major findings and the conclusions. Okay, so now there is actually mandates. Okay, so according to the US policies and the mandates, okay, and it comes from Energy Independence Society Security Act of 2007, that US supposed to actually produce about 36 billion gallons of ethanol. Okay, 36 billion, which is approximately 1/4 of the total gasoline, in fact, used in the US per year. It's a huge amount. Okay, and also according to this mandate, about 21 billion gallon, or about 58% of the total bioethanol fuel actually has to come from advanced bioethanol sources. So there is a category which I'm going to discuss. There are many categories, there are many sources from which bioethanol can be produced. You might have heard about the corn, which is the conventional source. So the conventional source, the bioethanol could have approximately 42% or about 15 billion gallons. This is the mandate, okay? And this mandate actually was established around 2007, and they had a projection. So what this figure is showing is not the actual, but the mandated projections until 2022, okay? So there is a huge amount of emissions. The ethanol has to come from the advanced biofuel sources. This is the major point. And as we know that the corn, for example, is currently being used as a source of ethanol. Okay, now, what is, just to give you some information about ethanol, okay? So it's all about the plants, okay? And we know that I'm sure that students have learned in 101 plant biology classes that the energy is being stored in plants through photosynthesis, chemical energy, and then it's being converted into thermal energy when it is burned. So it is the biomass which is burned and produce thermal energy. It's all about energy. Climate change is all about energy. 60% of the greenhouse gases come from the CO2 sources. Okay, it's all about energy. Okay, so we are looking for the alternative sources. So, but it's not only the biomass which can actually be a source of energy, but it also can be converted into the liquid form. Okay, that's what we call the ethanol, the liquid form. Okay, so in the US, ethanol is blended with with the conventional source of energy like gasoline, right? And can be used in the combustion engines, cars or other vehicles, right? So the most common ethanol blend in the US is about E10. You might have noticed when you go fill the tank, the E10. That is 10% of ethanol blended with 90% of gasoline. There are less popular blended sources, for example, E15 and E85, but they are less common, because the vehicles are not, manufactured with advanced technology. Okay, so this is another important information. What is ethanol? Okay, now, so ethanol, as I mentioned about ethanol versus cellulosic. So the ethanol can be produced from the sugar-based, biomass. So the sugar, in fact, actually is fermented and converted into the ethanol. Okay, and those sources could be corn grain or maybe sugar grain. Okay, but there is another source, biodiesel. Okay, and that can be produced from the oil-based biomass, for example, palm and soybean. Okay, and ethanol can also be produced from cellulosic. So what is cellulosic? So the biomass contains cellulose. Okay, cellulose is nothing but the plant cells materials. Okay, the plant cells material. Actually, in fact, there is because it's come from the plant. Actually, there is a huge amount of this organic matter. I think the study suggests this is the most abundant organic matter. In fact, cellulose. Okay, so the biomass contains 3 different types of plant, the wall material. They call cellulose, hemicellulose, and the lignin. Okay, and these can be burned to produce energy. Again, same thing, energy. Okay, and the most important thing about this material is that it does not come from the food part of the plant, but non-food part. For example, crop and wood residues you can think of, and industrial and other waste. But most importantly, energy crops, what we call the dedicated crops. You might have heard the term miscanthus or switchgrass, which are very common form of cellulose in the US and are currently being grown in different farms, just as a research, the research site's purpose rather than application. There's not much, these crops have been on a commercial base actually used to produce ethanol. Okay, I just want to make sure that I want to make this point clear. Okay, now how much is the current actually? I need the water because I have some allergy, so I'm sorry. So currently, about how much is the total production of ethanol? Approximately 28 billion gallon. Okay, billion gallon, billion is 10 to the power 9. So don't think that is a small number. I always remind my student, the graduate student, in my classes. Okay, 28 billion gallon, and of that 28 billion, about 55% is being produced. So by the U.S. and 27 by the Brazil, and 5% by United European Union, and the rest come from the rest of the countries, including India, China, and other countries. Okay, so now it's very clear. India, the US is the major producer of ethanol. Okay, this is another important point. So still, that the US is putting a lot of effort in actually to produce ethanol compared to other countries. Now, from where that ethanol is coming in the US? In fact, so the annual US production I've already mentioned is about 15 billion gallons. It's not about 15, it's about 16, but the 15 billion gallon is actually coming from corn. Okay, so what there I'm showing two figures. In the first figure I'm showing the corn, ethanol production from corn. Okay, and it is, the recent number is about 15 billion gallons from corn. Okay, there is a one additional gallon which comes from the cellulose, which I can talk later actually. So it fulfilled the requirement of the conventional biofuel targets, which I have already mentioned that, and based on the EISA, the mandate. Okay, now, but it fell short of the cellulose or advanced biofuel target, which I said about 20 billion gallon. Okay, so we have to, so the US government has to think about how to, or the industries have to actually put some effort to produce that ethanol from the advanced biofuel sources. Okay, but one thing I would also like to clarify here is that in the next figure, the bottom figure is showing how much of that ethanol, the corn base actually is being on how much of the land of the corn, harvested land, is coming from it. So it's about total, whatever the total corn area is, about 40% of that land is used to produce corn that is converting into ethanol. So it's a huge amount of land. Okay, but the important thing is that the US is already satisfying actually the need to come producing ethanol from the corn. So I don't expect that number has to go up and down. One other thing actually I would like to mention here is, you see that the top figure, it's not a constant, it's changing with time, and there are three reasons that ethanol production from corn could change. First is the policy. The energy policy could change from time to time. That's one reason. The second reason is the cost of corn, it also is a major factor. The third one is climatic or the weather conditions, right? So corn producing actually can be impacted due to the drought or other extreme conditions. So these are the three major reasons that actually could change the numbers. It's not always go higher or lower. Okay, it's fluctuates. So this motivates us to study the cellulose feedstock. As I already mentioned, we have not yet fulfilled the requirement of the mandate. Okay, and particularly in the US, we have done some analysis for the other countries, but today's my research, the talk is focusing on the US region. In particularly, what I'm actually going to discuss is what are the implications of growing the large-scale dedicated energy crops on water, energy, as well as carbon footprint. But I'm not going, I don't think so I would have a time to cover all this, so I will focus on two major points that impact on water and energy. Okay, now just to give you some background about the cellulose, the feedstock, the energy crop or bioethanol crops. As I already mentioned, there are two major crops currently being grown in the US and are the potential source of cellulosic ethanol. Okay, they are switchgrass and miscanthus. These are called the perennial grasses. The perennial grass means that they need not to grow every year from the seed. Once they are grown, and then we can harvest in the winter, and then the root parts can again give the shoot in the next year. Okay, and they can be adaptable to the wide range of growing condition. As I will show you, it can be grown anywhere in the US, but depending on that what land can be used actually to grow these energy crops. Okay, another important thing is that they are high yielding crops, quite high. In fact, I'll show you some figures. But unfortunately, my issue is that most of the studies are done on a state-of-the-art managed crops, the area. So if you really want to grow these crops, we have to think about some land which is not currently being used for other purposes like agriculture or something. Okay. Another important thing is that it is compatible with the row crop, food crop production, and they don't require too much of nitrogen, and actually that's the plus thing. Okay, they don't require too much of nitrogen. Also, not irrigation too. Okay, whether they use water or something, that's a separate issue. But I don't actually expect, and we are not using irrigation to grow these crops. Okay, mitigation, they can mitigate the obviously negative impact of CO2 emissions, which is associated with the conventional source of energy, CO2, fossil emissions. But also it can help rural economic development, particularly major jobs can be created by growing these crops, and can provide the farmers additional source of the income as well. So there are some advantages, and that's why they are being considered as a potential source of ethanol. Okay. Now, but they are also concerned about biofuels, particularly in general, impact on the food prices. Obviously, if more corn is being used to produce ethanol, less food will be available, the price could go higher. Excess amount of water use, that's what I'm going to discuss today. Water quality could also be affected depending on what source of plants we are using to produce ethanol, and there could be some indirect land use effect offsetting the direct greenhouse. I mean, it's going to be export and import, and all those the factors can play important role. Okay, now few things also I would like to add that would actually clear this about these crops. Okay, here I'm showing you the physiological structure of bioenergy crops, but also row crops like corn as well as forest. So you have to compare these. As I've already mentioned, that there is a plant material that can be used, any kind of plant material, not only the energy crops but also the forest plant material. But the point here is that what is their physiological structure that favors to use these crops as a source of ethanol. In the case of, for example, row crops, right, the shoot part plays very important role. A shoot means the root, shoot and root, both parts play very important role. In the case of root part for the corn, when the farmers harvest the crops or plant the crops, corn for example, the root provides the nutrients as well as water. So that happens during the springtime, as I have shown in this first slide or first figure on the left. Then in the case of bioenergy crops, same process takes place when we actually when the farmers plant this the grasses or crops. One thing I would like to also mention, that they are not grown from the seeds, they are grown from the rhizome. That means the root being actually translocated, and then they grow actually. And the most important thing about is the rhizome. These rhizome what happen that springtime, the same in the translocation happen, that the soil can translocate the nutrients, nitrogen and water to the shoot, but During the fall, actually what happened when the senescence takes place and they don't grow anymore, then the shoot provide the translocate, in fact actually the the nutrients as well as somewhat water. Okay, particularly the nutrients. This is the most important actually the feature of these crops, that nutrients have to be translocated so the next year root can actually, the rhizome can regrow, right? So this is the most important thing. So we have to be very careful about where do we grow this. So senescence process is the most important process. Otherwise next year we don't want to apply the nutrients. That's the most important thing. And you can think of same process takes place for the forest, okay? But we don't harvest the forest. But in the case of the energy crops, we can actually harvest the shoot part above ground and use as a biomass to produce cellulose ethanol. Okay, so this is the most important thing is that the rhizome remain intact with all the nutrients, so then it can be used to grow next year. Okay, so this is the most important feature of these cellulose crops. Okay, but another thing is that why we are not using the forest. This is also another important point, that first of all, that not all the biomass material is favored in producing the ethanol. There are certain, and the properties of these energy grasses are such that they can produce more, in fact actually, ethanol than the forest. Another issue about the forest is it cannot regrow same next year, but these crops can grow 5 to 7 meter tall. Okay, so they provide a lot of actually the biomass every year. Okay, now so we have addressed in our study two questions: where and which bioenergy crops can achieve high and stable biomass production and bioethanol yields in the US, and the second one is what are the implications of high yielding these energy crops on water quality and water quantity. Obviously we have also done this analysis about the actually carbon and the nitrogen, which I'm not going to discuss today because of the time constraint. Okay, now so our approach is that we develop, as I already mentioned, that my student who was interested in this project developed a model data framework to estimate the interplay between these these energy crops, water fluxes as well as carbon, and we focus our study in the US. Okay, so now I have a couple of figures from our university farm site. You could see the first one. In fact, actually, it's a scientist working at our lab, and his height is about 5.7 meter, and that miscanthus can go even 7 to 8 feet. Again, I must admit that this is not a general, actually the production on average is not that miscanthus cannot go that high. Actually, I had a long conversation with private industries. They cannot see that high yielding miscanthus in overall on a global scale or the US scale. The the height cannot be that much higher. Okay, because it's a research farm, and my take is that it is well planted, actually the soil is quite fertile, there's plenty amount of water, and there are many other things which favor to grow these crops, and Illinois is quite fertile land, so I'm not surprised that they have this such high yielding miscanthus in that region. But if you just go and add any other standard land, perhaps you will not see such high yielding miscanthus. I admit this. Okay. Second one is also is a switchgrass. There are two switchgrass which I'm going to discuss in the next slide. So here are the two switchgrass are cavern rock, which is we called upland. It's mostly is grown in upper the northern part of the US, and there is another one, the lowland, actually which we call the Alamo. You might have heard this. It's very common in the US. It's a native of the US. In fact, it's a lowland. It's actually grown in the southern part of the US. Okay. Okay, and also we use the corn. So these are the three energy crops, and we compare our estimates with the corn. Okay, now, okay, so now the model, so we have developed the model, as I already mentioned. It is the land climate interactive model, account for the carbon, nitrogen, water, energy, and everything, and it is quite detailed, and I need not to say that because I have already published many papers on that model. And just to give you some sense that my student actually who worked on it developed the crop model actually with the support of project funded to Dave Niyogi, and he was very kind enough to involve in his project funded by the USDA. And then we developed the model, crop model, and then we implemented also the energy crops, and it has a quite detailed, and I should not say detail, and I'll keep on saying detail, but so it's quite, it accounts for all the features which are required to grow these crops in the model, okay? But a few things which I also would like to mention, that we ran this model at a 0.1 by 0.1 degree over the entire US, okay, run at a 1 hourly time scale, okay, and include almost everything which we expect to include in terms of calculating the productivity. Few things which I also would like to mention, some input variables. There are some requirements when we grow these crops, not once it is grown. The very first year we have to apply the nitrogen when we grow these energy crops, and here are the numbers, okay. We also actually, we don't irrigate actually, but we irrigate the corn wherever it is being irrigated in the US, and actually we plant corn every year, but in the case of energy crops we plant only once, okay, in 1980s, and then we harvest every year and then again regrow again next year, okay. Harvesting fraction of bioenergy crops, we don't harvest 100%. You might have noticed the stubble on the agricultural land. We leave some stubble. In the case of the miscanthus, about 85% is being harvested. In the case of switchgrass, about 94%, and and for corn 100% grain. But we also use corn stover, which is not the grain part of the corn, but actually non-grain part of the corn. So we harvest only 30%, and the 70% remain on the ground. And in fact, actually, until the next growing season, it actually falls on the ground and then decompose and release back some of the carbon, and some goes in the soil. Okay, so it is kind of accounting for everything what we see on the ground. Okay, so so just to quickly go through a few things, we use our site, Urbana site data to evaluate, not to evaluate, to calibrate our models. And definitely we really need some detailed information. We just use one single site, calibrate for the yield, for water, for other the purposes. But then we also have looked at it many other sites on a US scale for different variables to evaluate the model. For example, sites validating the biomass yield, sites validating the other variables like water, nitrogen leaching, everything which we calculate. Okay, now, so I'm not going to go in depth about the corn. We have also done quite detailed analysis on a global scale about the corn and compare our estimates of yields for corn, and this is what I'm showing here. It's published already, so I'm not going to go in depth about how much is the yield for corn and how the model is performing. Just to give you one example that our model does quite good job. You have to take my words, and in producing the corn yield. Okay, we also look at many other aspects of climatic impacts on yield. So we have done quite detailed analysis in terms of understanding the corn productivity in the US as well as on a global scale. Now, first question, where and which bioenergy crops which will achieve the high stable biomass yield? In fact, we have looked at it different ways also, but here I'm going to focus only overall impact, overall actually bioenergy crops. So now, these are the three bioenergy crops. Yield is how much is the biomass per hectare. So whenever I use yield, is always per hectare. Okay, production is only tons, but here tons per hectare. I want to clarify this. Okay, so this figure is showing how much and where the these 3 crops can be grown. So in the case of miscanthus, you could see not everywhere, okay, it can be grown. So we define the productivity based on what we call hardy zone. The hardy zone means the temperature transition, you know. So think about those miscanthus cannot grow above this hardy zone 4. That is, above that zone, temperature gets lower than -28. What happened is that as the temperature goes lower in the northern high latitude, because these are the perennial crops, during the winter time, the roots actually die under this colder climate condition. So we cannot grow there. Okay, we have already looked at it based on the data. We also see that on the western side, we cannot grow this because there is not enough water. Okay, as I already mentioned, we don't want to actually grow this crop with applying the irrigation. We want to make sure that we are using least resources to grow these crops. And also you could see in the southern part of this, miscanthus, there's not much yield because southern part is more warmer. Okay, as I already said, that warmer condition would not be favor senescence process. So nitrogen would not be enough to grow for the next year. So the rhizome cannot actually be fertile enough to actually produce ethanol biomass in the next year. So similarly, now you could see, okay, so in case of miscanthus, the maximum yield which we calculate is about 25 tons per hectare. Okay, now if you look at our university farm side results, they show about 40%. We could not get it. Okay, I just admit that. Okay, now in the case of cavern rock, which is the upland switchgrass, it actually the yield is the lowest in compared to 3 different crops, and it's only up to maximum is about only 15. But it can go a little bit in the north. This goes up to the hardy zone 3, which is about, I think, -23 degrees Celsius temperature. Okay. Now in the case of Alamo, which is common, actually very popular in the US, and there are already actually the plants which are actually using Alamo to produce ethanol, but it is actually more popular in the in actually southern part of the US. Okay, but the yield for this crop is higher than cavern rock but less than miscanthus, goes up to 17 tons per hectare. Okay, so now we can also convert now these yield to the ethanol, right? By the way, how am I doing with time wise? Okay, so we can use conversion factor. So here we have used the conversion factor to convert yield into the ethanol. Okay, now I'm actually going to give you couple of numbers. So in the case of corn, it's about 491 liter ethanol per dry matter, which I have shown in the previous slide. Okay, and in the case of stover and energy crops, is less, about 331 liter ethanol per dry matter of corn or biomass for energy crops. Okay, now so these figures are showing how much is the ethanol these crops are produced. Now I have not mentioned one thing, that these crops what we grow for the entire US regions. Okay, so within each pixel of 1.1 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer approximately, we grow miscanthus, we grow corn. Corn in fact actually is grown wherever it is in the harvested areas actually, and also cave rock and as well as Alamo. Okay, we also have mentioned that about the stover. So 30% of stover is used for producing ethanol as well. So we combine grain plus corn stover to calculate ethanol from the corn. Okay, so this is what we are showing in figure F. So ethanol from stover is shown in the E figure and corn from the D figure. Okay, just to give you some sense. Okay, now so I also defined the potential bioethanol yield. If think about it, if each pixel of the land is growing, you know, these crops which has the maximum potential to produce ethanol, maximum. Okay, and I picked that 6 pixel and plot it on that pixel crop, which particular crop can be used to produce maximum amount of ethanol. Okay, now few things I would like to also mention here is there is also a white region, hatched region. This is the region where the corn is grown, harvested area in the US. Now you can look at it that, you know, the production potential, so the Kevin rock actually can go only on the actually northeast part, okay, on top, okay, but corn in north and central west region, and which is shown here by this, you know, the red one. And you know, this is the major Midwest region. Only miscanthus can have a much higher, you know, ethanol yield in this region, and obviously Alamo is in the south. Okay, so this is the potential. This is not the actual, but this is the potential. Okay, now we can also look at it, how many grid cells are used to produce high amount of ethanol from the crops as well as from the grasses. Okay, so this figure shows, just to clarify, this actually figure showing from the starting 0 that how much is the maximum yield produced from these grasses and the corn, and then how it is actually declining in terms of the number of actually the grid cell which are being used to grow these crops. Okay, so what it shows that miscanthus and Alamo has the highest yield, which is approximately ethanol. This is the ethanol, not the biomass yield, is about 8.5 liter, okay, kiloliter per hectare per year. Okay, and then but it actually drops very sharply, you know, here, you know, this one. Okay, now in the case, in both cases, you know, miscanthus as well as Alamo. In the case of you know, miscanthus and actually yes, Alamo. So this one is Kevin rock. Actually, its yield is lower, in fact, and also drops sharply. So you could see that how much is the percentage of the grid cell is being used to grow these crops, and I shouldn't say used to, but is actually high yield, you know, the grid cells. And actually the good thing about this is that it drops very fast, but it can grow much longer. It means it can cover much higher, you know, grid cells to grow. Okay, so that's something positive for these you know, crop. Okay, but in the case of corn, in fact, actually it can cover much larger region. Another important thing is what you could see here, you know, it drops slowly, not very fast. You know, drop is not fast, so the variability over time is not that much. Okay, in case of other crops, they can be grown in certain, you know, grid cell and produce high yield, but not much area is being, you know, is dedicated which can grow high yield, you know, for these crops. Okay, now so this is the bottom line, that there are the regions where all these crops can be grown, but not many grid cells or area which can produce high yield of these crops in terms of the ethanol or biomass. Now let's talk about the water part. Okay, implications of growing these crops on water quality and the quantity. So this figure shows ET. ET tells you about the amount of water consumed and released by the plants. Okay, so this figure shows the ET for corn, miscanthus, Alamo, and also for Kevin rock, and one can clearly see that ET is much higher, okay, for corn than for 3 other crops. Okay, this is the absolute value. It is not an ethanol, but per ethanol basis also the trend looks very same. Okay, so the ethanol, the ET is, I'm sorry, I'm not saying right. Actually, the ET is the lowest. The reason is water consumption is lowest because, you know, the roots are not that deep. Okay, and the growing season is also not that long, because as I've already said that in the case of energy crops, the growing season goes up to the winter time, you know, when it is being harvested. So water consumption is very high, roots are deep, so that's why they consume lot more water and actually has a higher ET. Okay, so energy crop production can reduce. That's another disadvantage about regional water availability by the humans for other purposes, right? So large more consumption of water, less available actually for other purposes. Okay, now we can also look at it, in fact, actually the leaching part. Okay, that how much amount of the nitrogen is leached, and this is the figure. The bottom one is showing about actually the corn has a higher leaching. Okay, by the way, I forgot to mention that I'm showing the two bars. One is for the Midwest, where most of the this corn is being grown, and others for the globe, for the entire USA. Okay, but miscanthus, which produce the highest amount of yield, has the least leaching. Again, two reasons, and also for the Cabin Rock too, that nitrogen applied to grow these crops are not much compared to the corn, but also that most of the water is being consumed by the roots, because they have a very thick roots, and less goes infiltrated in the lower soil layers. Okay, but for some reason Alamo is actually showing much higher because of the soil properties in the southern part of the US, and that also bit surprised us. Okay, but that's what actually we have looked at some data for soil, and it sounds like actually the soil is not fertile enough there, and actually infiltration is much faster in that region. Okay, so that's why the Alamo has a much higher actually leaching. Okay, so runoff is also the issue, right? So the runoff is high for the corn compared to the miscanthus and Alamo, and a very same or similar to Alamo. Okay, now another issue we can think of is the climatic impact. Okay, so we have also looked at this issue because I have already mentioned that extreme climate events can have an impact on the productivity of this actually plant. What I'm showing you here, we have just as an example. Okay, that we know that 2012 was the severe drought year, and how it has impacted the yield if we grow during this time at these crops, and also the grasses as well as corn. And as you could see from this figure, that yield for the corn just get dropped because of the drought effect, but for the other crops it's not being impacted, mainly because the roots are intact enough, and they can extract the water from the deeper soil layers, so they are not being impacted. Okay, so that's one advantage of these crops. Okay, now I can come to some conclusions, but there are many conclusions I can draw, but few major one. First one is that we can grow these crops in the US. There's no problem, but these regions tend to be where corn is currently grown, particularly Midwest. Okay, we have noticed that miscanthus, which is the high yielding the grass, can only grow in Midwest. Okay, most bioenergy crops have the maximum potential of bioethanol yields across Midwest region, but harvested area, as I've already shown, that the yields just drop, certainly not grown in many of the beet cell. So the harvested area for high bioethanol yields are limited, resulting in the lower bioethanol yields than for corn. Okay, so the third one is that growing bioenergy crops improves the water quality. I've already said that. Not much nitrogen leaching, but it consumes a lot of water. That's a major issue which we have found in our study. Okay, so what is the home take message? This is my statement. Others maybe disagree with what I am saying, but in my opinion, a choice for move towards energy crops as opposed to the corn as a source of bioethanol would likely be motivated by the balance of other factors, not ethanol. Okay, could be economics, or could be life cycle greenhouse gases, or could be competition with the food and other types of production of food, land use could be another reason. Climate extreme, as I already mentioned, that climate extreme has least impact on the productivity of these crops. Runoff, nitrogen runoff, or moving to the more advanced technology. Perhaps in the near term future, perhaps we may have some more advanced technologies that could overcome certain issues. Maybe we can get some new hybrid or more advanced technology which can produce these crops with less consumption of water. With this, I will close my talk and I will be happy to answer any of the questions. Thank you very much.